You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We have our first guest on the program today, so I want to welcome back, and thank you so much. Charles Hoskinson is the opinion editor with the Washington Examiner. Charles, welcome back, and thank you.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to discuss two things with you today, which are, in my opinion, probably the opposite ends, but they both involve, unfortunately, use of force or violence. And so if we can, Charles, if we could start with the two stories, which are, and I'm sure there's more that we could refer to, and in fact, I was just touching on a couple, but you have two police-involved shootings. One was in Los Angeles, the other was in Ferguson in Missouri, and I always believe it's hard to, until an investigation is complete and all the facts are really looked at and we fully know, we're just going, we're discussing the issues and the ramifications. We don't have all the facts to clearly, distinguish who was responsible, who was guilty, who was innocent. So, we need to be careful here.
Certainly, and these are matters where the details are important, and you have to be, as you said, you do have to be careful. But we can talk about the broader issue.
Oh, sure. And now, I was just, before we brought you on, I was setting up the idea that, this is nothing new. This is something that's existed since the beginning of man, that whatever police force you have, regardless of your society, there's always going to be some sort of a confrontation between civilian and police, both good and bad, and sometimes it's justified and sometimes it's not, and so that's why we have these investigations. But I can recall, I think that in recent years we've seen several stories around the country where police have just been executed in the streets. You look up in some of the events in California, particularly Oakland, some extreme violence. You've seen a lot of, like we see in Missouri, you've seen the riots. And, so the first question would be, how do you justify a potential bad shooting by rioting and looting your own neighborhood? So that would be the first starting point for me. I think that the rioting needs to end. I think it's completely uncalled for, unsupported, and it makes, turns something that's a tragedy into something that's even more wrong and just not good for anybody in any of these towns and cities.
Well, police-involved shootings, even of unarmed people, are probably more common than most people think. They do happen. They do happen more than you're probably going to see them break into the national media, like the death of Michael Brown in Missouri. But as you mentioned, also shootings of police, these things happen. But when you get to a situation where that shooting triggers a riot, like has occurred in St. Louis or in the St. Louis area, that shows a sign of a deeper problem. That's a sign of a deeper problem. That's a sign of something possibly being broken in police-community relations.
Well, that's a very good point, and I think you could point to New York City many years back. I think that the last, going back to Giuliani and Michael Bloomberg, I think both their administrations and their police forces have done an excellent job at repairing a lot of that, because you had a lot more violence and you had a lot more conflict between police and civilian there. So I think that's a model to look at, but I think you're absolutely right. And I know there are a lot of social and economic factors in these cities that, maybe the mindset of the average person there is different from you and I as a result of the environment that they're in. And like I'm looking at some of the facts here. It's being reported by CBS here that 90% of the police force in Ferguson is white. So perhaps, it may be an issue, it may not be an issue, but it's something that's going to be discussed and certainly looked at, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, race can be an issue, but there's also, there's black culture and there's white culture. There's also a police culture. I mean, it doesn't, if you have a community a community of mostly black people, where all the police officers were black, you're still going to have the question of how hard do you want the police to patrol the streets? How militarized do you want the police department? A lot of American police departments are becoming very highly militarized, almost to the person on the street looking like an occupying army. I mean, if every police officer in that community were black, would the people in that community still want the police officers to challenge any young person walking the streets in a certain way or at a certain time? Or would they prefer that the police stay in their cars? Or would they prefer something in the middle? This is a thing that every community has to decide.
This is John. And by the way, do you prefer Charles or Chuck?
Chuck is fine.
Okay, fair enough. Well, once we've had you on a few times, we have to go through your casual name. Chuck, there's a couple of interesting dynamics at play here. First, we'd like to give our police the benefit of the doubt, but as you pointed out, while most cops, like most doctors, are good citizens doing the best job that they can, there are certainly those that are that, let's say, have not earned the right to receive the benefit of the doubt. But at the same time, I think we have a really tough dynamic at play here, because while the police often are not particularly tolerant of citizens in general, I mean, you see this on a fairly regular basis, they also have a particularly brutal job, because when you look at many of these inner city areas, let's be frank here, you got rough neighborhoods, and these guys
Absolutely.
want to get home to their wives and kids. So the bias, you have to ask the question here, are police, are even cops who are judgmental, are they biased, or is some of this a level of learned instinct, if you will?
It could be both. It could be either. I mean, I've been out on patrol with black police in tough neighborhoods that are mostly black, and these guys generally aren't any less hardcore in a sense that they're looking to keep themselves safe, that they have the intention of cracking down on crime. They don't. It's not, race does not necessarily make a police officer decide he's going to take a soft touch. But now there are some police officers who believe in being more negotiators than enforcers, and there's some who believe more in being enforcers than negotiators. And some of them are white, and some of them are black, and some of them are Asian. And I think it's what you're looking at is a dynamic that has a lot of factors in it, and the only thing you can really conclude at a time like this is that if you've got a situation where you've got heavily armed police in the streets and people rioting in the streets, then something is wrong with one of those dynamics, and it has to be investigated and sorted out.
Yeah, to touch on something that you had mentioned earlier, I think it's important that our elected officials, as high up as going to the president, I think when your policy is always divisive talk and separating people from one another, I think it helps lend to the division that you see in a place like Ferguson. Because I think if your leaders were talking about unification and making better community ties, it would spiral down the ladder, if you will, to things as small as the police communities. And I don't think that this is happening right now. And I definitely, that's part of the conversation that we should be having as well.
Absolutely. And, in a sense, a community gets the law enforcement it deserves. I mean, if you want to see a police officer driving through your neighborhood every night because you don't feel safe otherwise, that's the way a person's going to vote. And then there are other people who say, well, I don't want them driving through my neighborhood every night. I want them driving through the rough neighborhoods every night. But how do you define that? The police can't be everywhere at once, and so they tend to congregate in higher crime neighborhoods, and you have the tension between the people who say, for example, the residents who say, for example, don't want to see young people congregating on the street corner at 3 o'clock in the morning, and would like to see the police come and break it up and send them home, and the other people who might be parents of those young people who don't want the police harassing their kids. There's that potential conflict in any community.
Chuck, I love your statement about the community gets the police they deserve, because I think that's actually probably a very astute way of characterizing much of this conversation. But I would characterize the problem to a large extent as a trust gap, and I think there's a caution flag to be thrown up here. We know there is an entire industry of race baiters, and that's a huge problem because it's proven to be successful. I mean, you race bait long enough, you get a job on as an anchor on CNBC. But the other side of that trust gap is that the whole idea of being tried by a jury of your peers falls apart completely. Did I say CNBC? I meant MSNBC. Thank you for the correction in the chat room. But the problem is that the whole idea of a trial by a jury of your peers, I mean, those same race baiters are basically out there now calling for witnesses to counter the police version of the story. And I, for one, want the truth, because I don't want violent gangs running around the street of our city where there's no law and order, and I also don't want to live in a police state. So, quite frankly, I want the truth. If a cop does wrong, like the cop who clearly choked someone to death, on camera recently, then throw the book at them. But if the police are, if it's one of these things where it really requires a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, especially in one of these neighborhoods where crime is so prevalent, I always have to give a little bit of edge to the police, because I think society falls apart if you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, race baiting never helps. I mean, if you take race out of the equation, you still have the question of how do you want the police to interact with citizens on the street at any time of the day, 2 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock in the morning, whatever. I'll tell you a little quick story if you've got the time. About 20 years ago, I worked for the St. Petersburg Times in Tampa, Florida, down in the bureau in Tampa, Florida. We had a police-involved shooting one night. It was an unarmed man was shot by shot dead by 2 police officers. One was white and the other was Hispanic. He was a black man, and at the time the police chief was black, as was the commander of the special team that the 2 officers involved in the shooting belonged to. He was also black, and it was a very tense situation where you had a potential for unrest. And the police chief went out there and he called up some of his friends, and they all went out and they talked. They went around and they said, "Listen, we're going to have an investigation on this. We're going to." This was in probably the roughest drug corner in all of Tampa, in front of a public housing project. He said, "We're going to have an investigation. We're going to have an open process here, and we're going to let you know how it turns out. But if you riot tonight, you're going to jail." And there was no riot. And about the same time, this was about 20 years ago, about the same time, there was a similar situation in St. Petersburg, Florida, where a white police officer shot a young black man. The white police officer claimed the young black man was trying to run him down with a car. And there were riots that tore the city apart. And it was in each case, probably the individual dynamics in the community made the difference between having a riot and not having a riot.
Yeah, that's interesting. John and I happen to have a cousin he's been on the police force through numerous towns in Florida and has made his way up to chief in Bradenton. He recently retired from there, and he's in another town. But he was actually shot in Tampa, worked on the drug task force many years ago, and these guys put their lives on the line, and many of them pay the ultimate price, trying to maintain some level of civility. But Chuck, I could say this: we all feel bad for everyone who's involved in these on both sides. You feel bad for the police and their families. You feel bad for the civilian, if you will, who is shot. Some rightfully so, some not. It has a major impact on all the people involved, the families, the friends, but certainly the community. So I guess the only thing we could ask for here is, as much justice and following the law as we can. But with the few moments that we have left, I'd like to transition, if we can, to what I would term mission creep in Iraq. I'm troubled. Yeah, I'm a little troubled by the fact that the president started off this new affair in Iraq by saying we're not putting boots on the ground, knowing that he already put in, anywhere from 500 to 700, boots, so-called advisors. I guess they really aren't boots. They don't have boots. They're wearing sandals. Who knows? But now you're in a position where, and I support helping these people in Iraq. I support the humanitarian mission. But now we're bombing. We're entering war with ISIS. And I call it mission creep because where does it end? Does the president have any control to just say, we're not putting troops, we're going to limit the amount of strikes, we're going to limit anything? I don't think he can.
He may not be. I mean, he theoretically he has control, but I mean, Obama's come full circle. I mean, what we've got here is kind of like a pale imitation of Bush's Iraq strategy. We've gone from denouncing regime change to endorsing it, and don't expect him to make any apologies to George W. Bush. He still pretends that this is a different situation.
No, that's a good point. And I mean, let's think about this. He ridiculed the nation building, and I mean, I would argue that Barack Obama's, not doing a very good job of building this nation either. But now you're back to a point where you're getting yourself involved in trying to reorganize the government in Iraq, potential nation building, dealing with he made the pronouncement that Al-Qaeda has been significantly damaged and they're on the run. But to me, I don't know, ISIS seems to be a lot stronger than Al-Qaeda ever was. And they now have their own
it's
state.
It's the bigger threat, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, you just said that's the big. I mean, they have territory, they have oil, they have water, they control the main dam in the country. They have tons of American arms that we gave to the Iraqis, and the Iraqis abandoned when they ran. They're definitely going to be a bigger threat than Al-Qaeda ever was, because Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan was a guest of the Taliban, and the Taliban gave them some pretty much free reign, but they could have kicked them out too. They could have decided one day, well, we're going to kick you out. These guys control their own territory, and the only way to kick them out is to go in there and kick them, basically force them yourself. And the Iraqi government can't do it. Nobody else is doing it. I mean, who ultimately the question is who's going to do it? Because someone has to do it. If someone doesn't do it, they're going to get stronger.
Well, I think that's a couple of the most important points. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when and where. Would you rather them be much stronger and fight them here, or would you rather them still be in their infancy and fight them there? You've seen what they've accomplished in their infancy, and I don't know what your opinion is, but I'm of the mindset that their brutality isn't just a 7th century throwback, but that it's actually part of PSYOPs warfare. I believe they want everybody standing before them to be so terrified that they're just frozen like a deer in the headlights. And you know what? It's working. And it's not to dismiss their brutality as just simply a legitimate war tactic. It's to say that it is done with, it's not just an old religious doctrine. I think it's done with great malice and intent. I think that's why they're publishing it so much on social media, and I think it has the whole world shocked and afraid. But can we turn that into action, and do we have a leadership that would effectuate that action to results? That's the question.
I totally agree with you. I mean, one thing that people who like to call these guys barbarians, and I've done that too, you have to keep in mind is that these are people who marry 7th century morality with 21st century knowledge. They are very smart. They have command of the latest technology and know how to use it. And as you said, they know how to use the latest psychological methods as well. Their morality may be straight out of the 7th century, but their methods are not.
Now, I'll tell you what I think is a particularly scary concept is one of the benefits to Al-Qaeda and negatives of the world against Al-Qaeda, it was the structure of having a central theme but essentially freewheeling agents that could sort of listen to somebody espouse, that it's time to take action, and then these people anywhere around the world can do evil things. The problem here is that you now have a centralized militaristic force that is, as you say, combining not just 7th century mentality with 21st century technology, but also with 21st century weapons and 21st century financing. I mean, they've got billions right now because they're stealing it. The concern that I would have is since Al-Qaeda all of a sudden isn't the big guy on the block for the crazies to follow, start thinking about all of these ragtag, and this is something it just occurred to me when you were speaking, but I haven't seen anybody in news say, if Al-Qaeda folks, the remnants all over the world, start to follow ISIS, you have a real recipe for disaster. Now you have the worst of both worlds. You have a stateless enemy, and then you have a quasi-state caliphate, well-organized, well-financed enemy with weapons and extreme malice as its intent.
Well, this is what these guys are doing is taking the idea to the next level, really. I mean, what Osama bin Laden wanted to do with Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda is generally, the word Al-Qaeda is generally translated as network. It also, in Arabic, it also means basis. The basis. What bin Laden wanted to do was provide a ideological, financial nexus of inspiration for Muslims to rise up in their own countries and create Islamic states. And what you have here with ISIS is an organization that's committed to building one in reality. So this is the next level. Essentially the next level of what you might call Islamist revolution, where these guys are seizing and holding territory with an eye to strategic resources like oil and water and money, and their next stop will be to seize more territory and try to hold it. They have their eyes on Saudi Arabia. They have their eyes on other places. It's quite possible that groups in some of these other countries might see the opportunity to look and say, if we rise up here, then we can link up with you and get bigger and stronger.
Yeah, those are all valid points. And, Chuck, I would say that this is the wrong time in history to have the president that we have right now. And I could say this. Clearly, our enemies have a plan, enemies being these terrorist organizations. They have a plan, a very coherent strategy. Yeah, and I was going to say, we don't. First, we have to recognize our war on terrorism, and we have to sit down with the allies in the Middle East and work towards an alliance and a strategy that creates a more moderate Middle East and helps support the countries such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan and others who, before we lose them too. And I'm not sure we're going to do that.
Absolutely. I mean, as I wrote in my column today, the war in Iraq never ended. Obama just walked away from it and pretended it was over. And now it's flared back out of control. The Saudis are trying, the Egyptians are trying to find ways to blunt ISIS's ideological assault on their legitimacy, and we're not helping them in one bit.
No, absolutely. Well, Chuck Hoskinson, you can find him at CE Hoskinson. That's HOSKINSON on Twitter. You can find him at thewashingtonexaminer.com. Thank you so much for joining us today. We always appreciate it, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you. Y'all have a good afternoon.
You too. Take care, Chuck.